over, sorry, we have over 1,500 acres of conservation property owned by both nonprofit organizations and the town. Many different trails for folks to enjoy with their families. And we have lots of diversity. And there's one common thread that all of our landscapes contain. So the thing they all have in common are plants, and specifically native plants. A definition here is one that's widely accepted for native plants. And that is those plants have evolved with the local wildlife in a region over 1,000. And they have done that along with the environmental conditions. To simplify it a little bit, what we can say are native plants are the ones that grew here in this area before the Europeans settled the country. And as I go through the presentation, you're going to see lots of pictures of flowers. I've tried to label the names in as many places as I could. These are all plants that are native to New England, and that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So what's the big deal about native plants? What's so great about them? Well, first of all, in a time when we're reducing water usage and we have water bans on during the summer, native plants are drought resistant. They don't require all that extra coddling. There is no need to fertilize native plants because they've evolved here. They take care of themselves in the wild, and they can right in your own yard. There's also no use for pesticides, and it's safer for your family and your pets. Insects need them to survive, and we need insects to survive. About 96% of our songbirds feed insects to their young. So they need to have this food in order to raise a family. I don't know about you, but I've noticed in the last 20 years or so that the number of songbirds in the area has declined quite a bit. And that's being attributed to the poisons that we're using in our yard and the chemicals. Native plants are also 4 times more attractive to our native bees than exotic flowers. Use the term exotic flowers. I'm talking about the flowers that were brought to this country that didn't evolve here. They're not native. And they're typically the ones that are more commonly seen in our home gardens. And I'll give you some examples of those in a few more slides. And finally, another benefit is that native plants will stabilize our soils. They'll filter the water, purify the air, and support wildlife for us. So what's not to like? So here's a typical home landscape that you can find just about anywhere in our country. You can see that there are some foundation shrubs around the house to soften the corner and pretty things up. Many homes have exotic low maintenance perennials such as the daylilies that you see here on the right and the hostas that you see in the house on the left. And then there's also a large lawn. American lawns cover an area now that's 3 times larger than any other irrigated crop in the country. More than 63,000 square miles of lawn, which is about the size of Texas. And we continue to convert daily another 5,000 acres of new lawn to that total. We currently have a national obsession to have perfect lawns on our property. We pour time, money, and poison into the yards and into the air to create these green monocultures that are practically devoid of the rich diversity of flora and fauna that's present here naturally in New England. Our human-dominated landscapes no longer support our functioning ecosystems, and the remaining isolated natural areas that we have are just not large enough to support our wildlife populations. This is one of the reasons that people are seeing so many predators around town that typically 15 years ago we wouldn't see. Lots of bobcat sightings recently, and coyotes and bears are coming out of hibernation. We've reduced their area. Their backyard is not as large as it used to be. So there's a change coming, and it's coming fast. People are becoming more aware of how they can influence our environment to make it healthier. And they can do this by just changing the practices that they use to manage their backyard. People are thinking more about how gardening isn't just about the pretty flowers. It is fundamentally tied to our entire ecosystem. And thankfully, people are taking action. They're thinking about what we are or should be gardening for, that it's not just for us, that it's also about thinking about the effects that we have on other species. It's time to hop on that train. The COVID epidemic has been horrible and affected us all in many difficult ways. However, one of the good ways that the isolationism from COVID has benefited people is that they turn to their own backyard to spend time outside. And that spurred a renewed interest in gardening in the last 2 years. And because of that, many nurseries, and particularly native plant nurseries, have been selling out their stock and their seeds before the growing season even begins. One of our most vocal and popular advocates of this new change in gardening is Doug Tallamy. Doug is an entomologist from Delaware who's written several bestsellers that are available at our library that have served to open our eyes and our minds to the importance of our gardening decisions. So Doug says, in the past, we've asked one thing of our gardens, that they be pretty. Now they have to also support life, sequester carbon, feed pollinators, and manage water. This is a new and a long overdue approach to gardening. We need to include deep concern for our natural world and incorporate that into our gardening practices. See in the picture here, just briefly, the upper left-hand corner is our native spice bush, and below that is a spice bush caterpillar who will only be found on spice bush leaves. He's quite a funky little character, and fun to find in your own garden. This is a close-up here of the flowers that we see. And a spice bush is a shrub that's quite common in Pepperell, and it's called in native plant circles the native forsythia. So let's compare natives to exotic plants as far as their characteristics are concerned. So as far as maintenance is concerned, once you get your native plants in the ground and the roots are established, there's not much maintenance to them at all. Exotic plants, again, because they didn't evolve here, have to be constantly watered and fertilized, maybe pruned, and they need a lot of TLC. Matching the curb appeal of natives against exotics, they can go head to head. Both types of gardens can be designed to meet whatever your personal garden aesthetic is, whether you like a formal, very trimmed look in your yard, or a more natural look, or even a wild look. Both will fill that need. As far as disease and pest, most of our native plants are resistant to that. For example, again, because they didn't evolve here, they require constant fertilization and possibly some chemical treatments. We've already talked about water usage for natives, and regular watering is required for exotics throughout, excuse me, the growing season. Wildlife benefit, the natives evolved here. They coexist with the native wildlife, and they depend on each other. Our exotic plants, some will provide some wildlife support, maybe nectar or berries, but even to that point, the complete nutritional benefit is lacking. Invasive potential. Some native plants may be called aggressive, but by definition, native plants cannot be invasive. All invasive plants, however, are exotics. There's no natural predators to keep checks and balances. And on a regular basis now, states across the country are adding more and more exotic plants to their invasive list. And finally, for the effect on the local habitat, there's a natural balance that keeps our habitats balanced with native plants and promotes diversity in the landscape. Exotic plants, however, can crowd out native plant communities due to a lack of predators on them. And so there's beyond the aesthetic purpose of our exotic plants, there's really not much benefit. So I hope I'm not losing anyone yet. This is not bashing exotic night, but here's some of the common exotics that you'll find throughout typical home landscapes. You see the lovely forsythia bush that's harbinging of spring. Petunias that provide us with color all throughout the growing season, many different varieties. There's daylilies, which are prolific and deer resistant. And the much beloved butterfly bush, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, and a common iris. So while the exotics might provide some nectar, so you will see butterflies coming in on that butterfly bush, absolutely, and bees, or they might provide berries for the wildlife. But what you may not know is that there's very few of these that provide both nectar and pollen. The pollen's needed by the pollinators to feed their young. So if you're only providing nectar in your garden, those insects are not going to stay there. They're not going to lay their eggs in the area. They're not going to have caterpillars that are working on the plants, eating the plants as they grow and develop eventually again into the next generation. So you're only really supporting part of the cycle of the food web if you're just growing these plants. Also, berries that are produced by exotic plants, it's kind of like a Twinkie junk food diet for our native wildlife. They don't, while the wildlife will eat the berries, those berries don't provide the nutritional value, such as the fats that the birds need to support their lengthy fall migrations. This is Doug Tallamy's call to action. He says, we've allowed alien plants to replace natives all over the country. Our native animals and plants can't adapt to this gross and completely unnatural manipulation of their environment in time to negate these consequences. Their only hope for a sustainable future is for us to intervene and to right the wrongs that we've perpetrated. That's a pretty heavy statement. And as a gardener for many years, I'd really like to encourage all of you to consider the impact that we can have if we all become advocates or lead by example. Personally, I believe that we need to stop relying on the hope that other people are going to be the ones to make these changes. I believe that every one of us can make some kind of a change, more immediate in a more meaningful and effective way. This book here, shown on the screen, Nature's Best Hope, I highly recommend it. It's Doug Tallamy's book that will open your eyes about the impact that you can have. So let's talk just very briefly about exotics gone bad or gone wild. And those are invasive plants. Invasive plants are those plants that aren't native to our area. They were introduced either intentionally or unintentionally, and they've caused ecological, economic, or harm to human health. And it's hard to deny that many of the invasive plants that are common to our area are really quite beautiful, like the vibrant berries here of this bittersweet vine, or the brilliant red leaves of the burning bush. They're all exotic plants brought here for their beauty or their medicinal or herbal value, but they've run rampant across the landscapes. And they have established these populations and are competing with our native species for many different things, such as space, moisture, and sunlight. They're also costly to our economy. Last year, the people in the country spent over $127 billion to try to manage invasive plants. And it's a losing battle. So do we have invasives in pepperell? Oh, yes, we have many. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. There is a invasive plant list for each state. And our committee has identified the plants listed here as the ones that are more significantly populating areas of our town. So you can see in this initial picture here down front, this messy area is behind the Peter Fitzpatrick School at the edge of the playing field back there. It's nearly impassable to try to walk through this area. It's crowded with multiflora rose bushes, autumn olive, invasive honeysuckles, and you can see this network climbing up the trees that's invasive bittersweet, which will eventually kill those trees. Also, the plant that you probably most familiar with is a burning bush, which is a stunning bush in the fall, and many folks have them as hedges on their private property. However, this is a plant that's spreading now throughout our woodlands and again, taking up space, and the animals are not getting the correct nutritional value that they need from this plant. And there are many native alternatives to the burning bush that can give you that same effect, the beautiful color, but still provide benefit to native wildlife. Probably the other most common invasive in town is the Japanese knotweed. You can see that in bloom in the top corner here. It grows along our roadways. It's very common along streams and riverbanks in this lower picture. This is the canoe launch at the Nashua River behind the dam on the Main Street Bridge. And this area that's kind of a pinkish haze behind all of these tall trees follows all around the riverbank there. And that is Japanese knotweed. Really bad location for it, because as those seeds drop into the river, they're going to go downstream and eventually form new colonies. And then finally, one of the other more common plants that you'll see along the roadsides in spring is garlic mustard. Excuse me. So let's talk more about why it's important to rethink what pretty is. Let's start about thinking not about what a plant can just do for us, but by thinking about what it's going to do for other species as well. Plants need pollinators to reproduce. They need to have that pollen moved from plant to plant, and the pollinators in the form of bees, flies, ants, beetles, hummingbirds, butterflies, bats, and even some larger animals are the ones who move that pollen and allow the plants to reproduce. However, the champion pollinator are bees. 85% of the animal-mediated pollination is performed by bees. And there are more than 4,000 different species of bees. So it's not just the common bumblebees and the honeybees that we're talking about. You can see there's a long list of different types of bees. Honeybees, however, are not native, and they're currently declining in population due to diseases and the increase in rampant increase in chemical uses. And compared to honeybees, native bees are much more efficient pollinators. They're also able to pollinate some food crops that honeybees cannot. And these are very common summer garden vegetables, such as potatoes, tomatoes, eggplant, peppers, zucchini, and blueberries and cranberries. They do that. They can do that because of the type of pollination that they perform. So let's put them up against each other, bumblebees and honeybees. Bumblebees can forage for longer hours and in worse weather, so they can withstand the colder temperatures that we see in our area in September and October. They're also more interested in gathering pollen versus nectar, so the focus from them is on the pollination. They're more efficient and visit more flowers. They're known as the teddy bears of the bees, and they have these very hairy bodies that will gather more pollen. And they're the only pollinator that's strong enough to pry open some of the tightly closed native flowers, such as this bottle gentian that you see here, and turtle heads. So the bottle gentian in the picture, this is in my garden from last fall. And these flowers are completely in bloom. They don't open up fully. So I have a little very short video here to show you how effective the bumblebees can be. You can see they're getting right in there to do their business. They struggle to open the top, but they manage to do that. Now watch when they back out. And they tuck it all very neatly back into place and take off to the next plant. Sorry. So how do we attract pollinators and get them to come into our yards? Well, we need more than just pretty flowers. We need to provide them with the essentials that they need to live in an area and to live in their habitat. And those essentials are food, water, shelter, and a safe place to raise their young. The same essentials that we have for our habitat. Why do we need diversity in the garden? Excuse me. Each type of flower that you see here is unique for a reason. Color, the shape, the scents, they all play a role in the type of pollinators that plants attract. These pollinators are the key to the species survival and the ability to reproduce offspring. So if you look at the oxeye sunflower here, over on the far right, it has a very open layout. They're disc shaped and they provide an easy landing platform for many different types of pollinators. So you'll see butterflies and bees and some of the smaller flies on these flowers to pollinate it. Some plants have a more restricted access, however, and only certain pollinators are able to get in to access the pollen, like this fly honeysuckle here. You have to come up from the bottom in order to do that, and some insects are not able to do that. The cardinal flower here, which is a typical woodland flower that you'll see around town, is a real attractant for our hummingbirds. Also, some flowers have a color that might be more attractive to specific insects. And some of them, like this little spring beauty here, this little pink and white flower, they have little markings or landing pads, and essentially those direct the insects to where they can find the nectar of the pollen. So let's just jump back for a minute to the habitat essentials and look at them briefly. First one being food. Some insects are specialists. They're only going to lay their eggs on specific types of plants, certain species, and those are called host plants. So if you provide nectar for the butterflies, what they need to do to complete their cycle, their web cycle of, their life cycles, is that you need to also provide a host plant on which they will lay their eggs, and the eggs will hatch into caterpillars. And then when the caterpillars come out, they have food that's suited to them to eat. So if you have a wide diversity of native plants, it's going to bring you a wider variety of wildlife to the garden. So a couple of the specialists you can see here, the first one being the monarch caterpillar on butterfly weed, which is a type of a milkweed. The caterpillar in the center is a snowberry clearwing moth, commonly known as a hummingbird moth. And this is him nibbling on the trumpet honeysuckle vine in my yard, which is also a favorite place for the hummingbirds to come to enjoy the nectar. Water is also essential. all the garden visitors need water to survive. So if you can provide several safe places around your yard or your garden with clean, fresh water, it's much appreciated and well utilized, as you'll come to find out. Butterflies love to have a muddy little puddle to go in where they can extract the salt and the minerals that they need for reproduction. Bees also would like a shallow dish or maybe the bottom of a flower vase. And if you put some stones and water in there so they're not going to drown, that would be much appreciated. And of course, there's always bird baths, which are popular and have been for many years. The animals also need a safe place to hide from the predators and protect themselves against the elements. So shrubs and vines will help provide both food and shelter, are a very important part of our landscapes. If you can also leave some wilder space in the back corners of your yard and just kind of let them go, maybe leave a small brush pile there or a pile of stones, which provide great shelter for smaller mammals, for amphibians, and for insects. And the animals also need a place to raise their young. So many native bees need bare ground for nesting. So if you have a yard that's all lawn, you're not going to have any bare ground. The bees are not going to stay there and lay their eggs in the ground. So it's nice to have a little area that's maybe disturbed soil. It doesn't have to be a lot, but if you can provide bare ground, that's great. Many insects will nest in brush piles too. And the larvae overwinter in the plant stems. So one reason that many native plant gardeners leave their plant stems standing over the winter and don't cut them back in the fall, when typically gardeners will do that to make the garden look neat, is because that larva is it's growing through the winter, and it's going to come out in the spring. And if we cut it down, we're cutting off their lives. So typically a native plant gardener will wait until excuse me, when the temperatures have reached like over 50 or 60 degrees for maybe a week in a row. I'm thinking this is probably like late April, early May, and then you can go in and cut down the stems, because at that point the larva will have hatched out. We also all need a habitat that's free of herbicides and pesticides. I know many people have issues with mosquitoes and do spray for mosquitoes, hoping that folks know that spraying mosquitoes does harm more than just the mosquitoes. It puts all of our pollinators at risk. Bumblebees, for instance, absorb lethal doses of pyrethroids, which is the chemical used most typically for mosquito spraying. So that comes in into the bumblebees through the contaminated nectar and the pollen and kills them. And it's also been known to cause massive die-offs of monarch butterflies. And although these particular chemicals aren't considered lethal to birds or amphibians, the food supplies of those animals, which are insects, is greatly decreased. Another thing that a native plant gardener needs to do is to learn how to accept some imperfection in your garden. Unlike butterflies that only take the nectar and pollen from the flowers, caterpillars eat the leaves too. So it gives me great joy to go out in the yard and see that some of the leaves have been nibbled on my flowers. That gives me the opportunity to look under the leaves and throughout the plant to see what type of new butterfly, what new type of caterpillar might be enjoying that particular plant. So how do we find the balance? I'm not asking folks to go out and immediately tear out your existing exotic plants in your yard. It can be a gradual transition. But if most of your yard only has lawn and exotic plants, there's less food available to support all the natural food webs. If you're not going to have caterpillars, you're going to have fewer birds around. So think about reducing maybe the size of your lawn and incorporating some native plants into your garden. And as far as trying to find a balance, sustainable habit is composed of at least 70% of native plants. More is better. I know that's a hard number to reach, particularly if you haven't used native plants in your yard before, but it's something to strive for and something to think about. And it can be somewhat of a gradual process. So let's think about what's pretty and rethink it. Some of your friends and neighbors have agreed to share some of the many ways that they've incorporated native plants into their home landscapes. So I'd like to take a tour of some of Pepperell's native plant gardens with you. And I'm going to start with some of the public gardens. So back in 2017, I was helping Diane Temple, who's the person who is in charge of the library gardens and the Friends of the Lawrence Library gardening program. And she asked me if I'd be interested in helping her to design and install a new garden behind the library at the trailhead to the renovation of the Greens Brook Trail. That the trail was then and still remains the first ADA compliant trail on a library property in the state. So I was thrilled to be asked to help. And I said I would, but I had one condition. I wanted it to be all native plants. The area that we were putting the garden in, as I said, is at the entrance to a woodland trail. And it just seemed right to have native plants there to set folks up for the lovely, calm and beautiful walk that they can have behind the library. And we also took the opportunity to create some educational material to post at the front about native plant gardening. So you can see in this first photo here, this is what we started with. This was all torn out and we had bare ground to begin with. In the first year, we put in a bunch of wild strawberry plugs. We put in some shrubs like winterberry, some native azaleas, and we added some small understory trees such as serviceberry and this little red bud tree that you see here. We also added some perennials that will provide somewhat muted color throughout the growing season at various times. So this first picture on the lower bottom side on the left here was what the garden looked like after the first year. And the next picture shows it in the second year. And you can see how much the strawberries have spread out here and really taken hold. Great ground cover. You get the lovely little white flowers in the spring, and that's followed by the delicious tiny native strawberries, which the kids can nibble on as they're walking into the trail. So about a year or so after we installed that first garden, I was walking down the trail myself and came to a place in the woods that just kind of opened up to me and seemed like it was begging for some company. And I thought that this might be a nice place for our little visitors who needed to rest their legs halfway through the trail to maybe sit and play, enjoy the time in the woodlands. And so I come up with the concept of creating a small children's area in the back of the library. Deb Spratt, our library director, gave me free rein to go in and do what I wanted to do, which I truly appreciate. She's been very supportive in all the gardening ventures associated with the library. So to tie in a literary connection here, I named this area Pooh's Thoughtful Spot, which if you're a Winnie the Pooh fan, you'll recall that the little guy had this place in the woods where he'd just like to stop and be peaceful and think his fluffy thoughts. My husband helped me with this project. We brought in some tree stumps to form a little gathering circle. We made a rustic arborway entrance and planted Virginia woodbine here. And we planted a small garden with some woodland plants, and also provided some materials for the kids to stop and maybe make a fairy or a gnome house. Put a few shrubs and some ferns in here, and not much else. It's basically pretty natural looking in here. This is a hit with the moms in town looking for a free outing that's cool on a hot summer's day. And this garden here remains my favorite, although probably least ambitious project that I've done so far. Sorry about that. Okay. Since then, under Diane's leadership, the library gardeners have added some smaller plant spaces in the library grounds. One around back with a stone dedicated to Pepperell's own author illustrator, Barbara Cooney, who wrote the children's classic Miss Rumphius, about a lady who planted wildflowers all over Maine, specifically lupins. And so we planted this area with native lupins and some woodland phlox. We also have added a pollinator bed behind the garden, I think it's 2 years ago. And this is really flourishing, as you can see. It gets that warm heat coming off of the brick facade on the building, and has really taken off magnificently. And then this past year, we also added near the front entrance to the library, some native shrubs and a great woody ground cover called bearberry, which will eventually cover all this area that's where the mulch is showing. And one more, our newest library garden was put in just last fall. The Native Plant Advisory Committee had our first public invasive pull event last June. And we went in along with some volunteers from the Neshoba Conservation Trust and removed a great deal of multiflora rose, bittersweet, and bearberry from this area. As you can see in the front, there's a big hedge of this here, and this extended all around the edges of the driveway. So this particular area, what we did was we cleared it back of the few plants that were remaining there, tried to get as much of the invasive roots out as we possibly could, but we understand that this is going to be requiring ongoing maintenance to keep that at a reasonable level. Diane prepared a design, and we've planted 25 different species of pollinator flowers there in October. So we haven't seen what it's going to look like yet. But we've included a little pathway here so that guests are able to walk through the garden itself and see the flowers growing on either side of them as they're enjoying the space. This is going to be certified as an official Monarch way station garden later this year. We also hope that it's going to serve as a demonstration garden for homeowners to create what's commonly known as a pocket garden, this being a pocket pollinator garden. And what that means is that taking this area that was previously invaded by invasives, or maybe you've got a lawn in that particular area, and you take that space and consider it a pocket in the middle of the lawn where you can enjoy the plants and help the pollinators at the same time. The next public garden that we have is at the Peter Fitzpatrick School, which is slowly becoming our town's community center. This garden bed was particularly challenging. It doesn't get sun very much. It gets the early morning sun, and that's about it. It fades during the day. You can also see in this picture on the right that it's a very long, very long bed. And those dividing boards are holding back that center strip, which is actually filled with crushed stone, and was put into that garden to catch the runoff from the roof. It's a flat roof on top of this massive building. And so essentially what we had here was the opportunity to create a rain garden. And so as the rain comes off that roof, it naturally filters down through the soil and provides water for the plants in the two outer beds there. So the initial planting, you can see there wasn't much left in there after a massive workout. And I had a lot of help with this to remove many of the invasive plants. And there were some exotic plants in this bed, and we stripped it right down. All that was left before we planted again were some of the native ferns that were included there. And so again, these were all native plants that we put in. And you can see we planted that garden in the fall, and the next spring we had this beautiful display of spring flowers. These are the ostrich fern that already existed in the garden. And you can see there's this beautiful tiarella or foam flower along the edge of the garden, as well as some woodland phlox, and that's going to fill in and create a lovely border along the edge. Again, we put an information board up here, and we included many different varieties of flowers, which you can see here in this. This is the information board that's at the library. So we've got quite a wide variety that will provide season-long color. Another recent garden project is at the town hall. Last year, Pepperell Garden Club asked me if I'd be interested in collaborating with them to design a native plant pollinator garden in front of the town hall. As you can see from the top picture here, this was kind of a mess. And there were a lot of things that were overrun. There were invasive plants growing through here, as well as some poison ivy. And this area had kind of a steep slope, which is challenging, but it also had very high visibility to the town residents. I mean, this is our town hall. This is the building that people look to when they drive down Main Street, and we wanted it to look attractive. So here again was yet another opportunity to spread the message about native plants that I really feel passionate about sharing. So we talked through the design. We made some compromises, and the fact that not all of the plants in this garden are native, probably about 70% of them are. The others were added, mostly annuals, to provide season-long color and food for the butterflies. So the garden is a mix of one conifer tree and some native shrubs, and many different types of perennials. It looked beautiful last fall, and hopefully this spring we'll see it continue to enjoy the beauty of this garden. This is a project from a couple of years ago that the Neshoba Conservation Trust worked on a piece of their property. 2 years prior to that, they did a massive removal of invasive plants. And then they seeded the area down with native meadow species. A year or two after, they decided that they wanted to increase the diversity of the pollinator plants that were in that area. And they focused on the left side of this big area, which is about an acre or so, where they were going to put in an interpretive trail. And so we ordered 600 plant plugs and organized a group of plant enthusiasts to include trust members, folks from the garden club, and a group of students from the high school. And we spent 2 mornings planting the meadow, getting them all in. So everything we put in here are plants that are native to New England. They're all pollinator magnets. Because the meadow has both wet and dry areas, we were able to put a really nice variety in. We included cardinal flower, swamp milkweed, butterfly weed, asters, beard tongue, 2 types of mountain mints, scarlet bee balm, helenium, showy goldenrod, and New York ironweed. So that's kind of it for the public gardens. Now let's get into some of the private gardens. I'm going to start with my own. I have thousands of pictures of my garden and as it's progressed throughout the years. So I've got a couple of pages here. Give you an idea of what I've been doing. So 5 years ago, my husband and I built a retirement home just up the street from where we had lived for over 30 years. So we started with a blank slate. We were completely down to gravel. It's very poor soil. I was delighted by the fact that I was going to have a yard that had a lot of sun in it, which I had never had before in my previous home. And I wanted desperately to have a meadow there. So I spent the winter before we built the house planning out the gardens. That was as important to me as the house itself. So the first year, what I did to minimize weed growth on top of this bare ground was to plant a cover crop, a ground cover that is an annual. It's partridge pea. It comes up once. It can reseed itself and will come back somewhat in succeeding years, but it's not a bothersome plant. It's a bee magnet, and it was beautiful the first year. And I had a visitor come to my house and stand on the front porch and said, "I can hear your meadow." And she was listening to all the bees that were in there. Warmed my heart to hear that. The second year, some of the pollinator seed mix that I had put in started to take hold. If you're putting in a meadow, it can take 2 or 3 years for it really to become mature and well established. So in year 2, the black-eyed Susan started coming in. And then in the back here on this picture with the deer, we had some daisy fleabane plant itself. And as you can see, coming into year 3, the front of the yard is just full of colorful flowers from July through September. And all of the diversity began to take place. Plants invited themselves in. Some take several years, as I said, to become established. So every day was a new surprise to me going out in that meadow. I also, on the back and the sides of my house, have woodland gardens that receive partial to full shade. And I wanted these to be somewhat of a peaceful, quiet area to sit. And I've included in these gardens some really pretty woodland plants, Solomon seal, Jack in the pulpits. There's some bloodroot in here, spring beauties, which are beautiful little delicate plant. And as you can see, I've got a little water feature here. So that's one side of a path going into my south garden. And here's the entrance going in where we've put an arbor, and I planted that with trumpet honeysuckle vine. And the shrubs in the front here are flowering raspberry, which is another really great shrub that spreads really nice. It has a beautiful flower that looks kind of like a rose, and the bees love these. I also have a little quiet place to sit. And if you're a gardener, you'll know that gardeners never sit just to enjoy the peace of the garden, because your mind's always thinking about, what should I move? What can I do differently here? But this is the place where I like to go in the heat of the summer. And I've got it, it's cool, it's green, it's shady, and I've interspersed that with some lovely woodland plants that provide, muted color throughout the season. I have a sloped backyard that runs into the woods. I wanted this to go kind of natural and have it mostly low maintenance. So I was so pleased by the garden at the library where we put the strawberries in and the success we had there, that I planted one whole side of this back hill with wild strawberries that continue to flourish. And I can't tell you how many of these plants I've shared with friends. I also included some other woodland type flowers, some trilliums, some ferns, some early spring flowering phloxes, and running groundsel. You can also plot native plants. This was an experiment that I had, and I continued to try to see what likes to be potted and what doesn't. And so this one's been pretty successful. I've got bloodroot in here, sundrops, and some Solomon seal. Also put rose milkweed back in this garden, which is another host plant for monarchs. And the little purple flower on the right, probably not very commonly known and little used, is our native geratum, which is also a great spreader. And finally, my front yard, I get the afternoon sun in the front. This brick path here on the side, you'll see what we have for a lawn. It's limited. It's about 12 inches. I'm sorry, about 12 feet wide. It's a native fescue, so it's not your typical seed mix that you'd get at the hardware store. I had to send away for it. It's called eco grass. The benefit being that these grasses have very deep roots. And so you don't need to water them once they're established. They're not all native. They're not all native, but I have begun to incorporate some other low-growing natives in amongst the grass. Let's see, I also have some flowering shrubs that look quite lovely in the spring. Down in the bottom corner here, you can see barren strawberry, another wonderful little ground cover, much underused. Beautiful yellow flowers that the bees love in the springtime. Trumpet honeysuckle I have in several places in my yard. It really attracts the the hummingbirds. And I have recently started to grow it up over the top of the pergola that you see up on the top here. And it's in its third year of growth, it started to reach over across the top. So you can sit in there surrounded by the flowers. This also, the trumpet honeysuckle, blooms periodically throughout the growing season. And you may see it bloom 4 or 5 times during that period. So let's visit some other town gardens. The first being Susan Edwards. Susan is a devoted conservationist, and she lives in the woods like many people in town do. And she opted to have a very natural woodland look to her garden. So the house is settled right in there beautifully amongst the native plants that she's added. The first thing you see as you drive into her yard is this beautiful Dutchman's pipevine, which is a native, which is a host plant for the pipevine swallowtail butterfly. And that grows along the deck and the front porch of her yard. She also has a plant that commonly people think of as one that grows in waste areas and can be rather weedy. However, sweet fern, which is not actually a fern, it's a shrub, has a wonderful scent to it. And when the landscaper put this in, they decided to trim it back, prune it down, and it shrubbed out, and it formed this beautiful hedge on the slope here. So, sometimes you think that a native plant is going to be ugly or scraggly looking, but you can still play with them a little bit to give you the aesthetic that you want. Susan also has a nice crop of barren strawberry, that little ground cover that we talked about, and anise hyssop, which is actually a fairly common garden plant that we see around town, a great native, great pollinator plant. Another neighbor is Michael Veet. Michael is a bee expert, and he planted his own meadow in his backyard. You can see he's got a lovely little path that he has that winds through here out to his shed, gives him the opportunity to walk that. And I can tell you that I walk my meadow almost every single day during the growing season, because there's always something different to see. So in his meadow, among other things, Michael features bee balm, some coneflower species, heleniums, and native grasses. And at the edge of his garden, he's got some shrubs and this beautiful butterfly weed, which is also a milkweed. Susan LaRocco, one of my dear friends, has a traditional border garden, and she has gardens all over her property. Susan also lives in a wooded area, as you can see, and she has mixed natives with exotics in her garden. And the result is quite lovely, as you can see here. She's got bee balms, black-eyed Susans, mixed with Asiatic daylilies. She has peonies in there, alliums and penstemons. I particularly love it when I drive into Susan's yard to see around her lampposts this lovely bed that is mixed with Canada anemone, which has a beautiful white spring flower, and wild geranium, which has a pinkish purple flower a little bit later in the season. And although these are both fairly aggressive native plants and will spread rapidly, Susan has contained them in a raised bed here. And you can see how they drape right over the edges of the bed, and a favorite spot in her yard for me. And here's another less commonly used, what I feel is a very ethereal looking plant, and that's a tall meadow rue that she has growing up against her chimney. Jean Navard, a very passionate gardener, has both shade and sun gardens into which she has put many different types of blends of native plant species. So you can see in the shady garden here on the left, she has mixed ostrich fern, which is the edible fern, by the way, with yellow trillium, which is actually not native to New England, but a little further south of us. And she also has an area with ferns and May apples, a funky little plant that comes up fairly early in the spring and has these lovely little palmate leaves. She's also brought in Virginia bluebells, and in her pollinator garden, which borders a meadow, she's got some stunning combinations of colors to include this New York ironweed, which is this gorgeous deep purple color, coupled with cup plants. She also has some great trees and shrubs, pussy willows, and this gorgeous gray dogwood, which forms a hedge that lines her driveway. So she's got a great mix of plants there. One of my fellow committee members, Annette Kate, also lives in the woods. It seems like many of us do in town. Annette has, however, a very sunny backyard garden, and she's taken full advantage of that and filled it with some beautiful pollinator plants. She has several varieties of bee balm, again, the anise hyssop, and a great little plant right here, which kind of looks white, and I'll show you another picture of it soon, which is a mountain mint, a wonderful pollinator plant. She's also got the oxeye sunflower in here, very light and airy, and has a beautiful yellow color. She's got blanket flower, yarrow, more anise hyssop, and more black-eyed Susans. So a really great variety for the pollinators to pick from. Ken Hartledge and his wife Lucy. Ken is the president of the Neshoba Conservation Trust, and also the chairperson of our town's climate change committee. And Ken has somewhat of a traditional yard, with the exception of having a huge meadow in the back and another smaller meadow in the front yard. And he's provided me here with a couple of images of plants that just brought themselves in and planted themselves there naturally. Ken does nothing to maintain the area. He just lets it go wild, and to let the animals enjoy that. Another fellow committee member, Juliana Molina, lives in one of the older farms in town, fairly new resident, and we're happy to have her on the committee. She has a naturalistic front yard, kind of like a cottage garden, that goes well with the architecture of the house. And in that garden in the front, she has some tall phlox, daisy fleabanes, bee balms, and there are some daylilies mixed in there also. And in her backyard, I was amazed to see this huge swath of flowering dogbane over in the back of this picture here. You can't really see. These have very delicate little whitish pink flowers that just smell heavenly. And I've never seen such a large stand as what she has there. It's really quite beautiful. Jennifer Coviello, a mad gardener in town. I am quite jealous of her energy, her creativity, and the amount of time that she puts into her garden. And she does a lot with native plants there. And I'm just showing you a few examples of what she's done. She lives on a long private common driveway, and she's lined that with the native beach plum shrub here, which you can see how beautiful it looks in the spring when it's in bloom. And the great thing about it is it does bear edible fruit that Jennifer uses to make jams with, and it smells heavenly, and it looks beautiful driving along here. Naturally planted here are some flowering dogwood trees, and Jen has also put in some wild strawberries. One thing that she's experimenting with, she put in her own little pond, built it herself with her son a couple of years ago. And as a ground cover, she's brought in some native cranberry plants. And you can see how beautiful these plants are and the flowers are. And I'm dying to see what it looks like next season as they have taken hold and begin to spread around that area. Another dear friend, Diane Temple, who has a wonderful eye for design in gardens, has both mixed sun and shade in her gardens. She has turned a good part of her front yard from lawn into garden space. And you can see it's quite lovely here. She's got a nice, quiet, peaceful, and private place to sit outside and enjoy the yard. And I would call this a very well-designed native plant garden. She's mixed in sedges, which is like a grass and is important for many pollinators. Hollies, red bud trees, red osier dogwood, and she's got some of that bearberry ground cover in there, blueberries, goldenrods, and again, the oxeye sunflower, which you can see a little better in this picture on the right-hand side. She also has kind of a shady area in the front here where the bench is, where she's intermixed Canada windflower with some epimediums and some ferns in the back here. And Diane's also included mountain mint, has become a fan, and I mentioned this plant a little earlier down at the bottom here. The colors that you see here are true. They're the leaves are and the bracts around the flowers are a beautiful light bluish green color. And even though the flowers are not remarkable, the plant itself is. Diane's also been brave enough to include goldenrod into her garden. There are several species of goldenrods that do behave themselves well in the garden. They don't, climb and get out of control. They don't look weedy. You can see they provide a beautiful explosion for color. And more importantly, it provides food for the late season pollinators. And so do the asters that she's included there. Diane also has a little stone border that's along one of the public sidewalks in town. It was previously growing when she moved in there, mostly the daylilies that you can see intermixed here. And Diane has been slowly intermingling natives with that to include black-eyed Susans, a switchgrass, which is a native plant, and this is a cultivar called Ruby Ribbons, which has this lovely red leaf mixed in with it. She's added some smooth blue asters in here and some coneflowers. So she's got a great mixed bed to move forward with there. And I also have a lot of affection for this meadow that belongs to Paul and Pat Peavy. Paul Peavy worked on the project that I talked about a little bit earlier, the Neshoba Conservation Trust Meadow. And he was one of the folks who worked very hard to remove the invasives that were there initially. And he asked me after he had worked on that meadow project if I would be interested in giving him some advice, because what he wanted to do was to take his massive side yard, which was all lawn and some beautiful big trees, and convert part of that to a wild meadow. He wanted to enjoy the area. He loves taking pictures of wildlife. And this gave him an opportunity to have some more and bring them right into his own backyard. So we talked about it, kicked around some designs, and his little pocket meadow is, it's not really that little, but you can see that it's fairly contained. He does mow the edge, gives it a nice, neat look. He's got some pathways that run through it, so he can walk through there with his camera and enjoy the beauty of the mix of all of these great native plants. So I'd like to kind of leave you with a quote from the environmentalist Jane Goodall, who tells us that you can't get through a single day without having an impact on the world around you. What you do makes a difference, and you're the one that has to decide what kind of difference you want to make. And I'd like to say, but don't underestimate yourselves and the impact that you can have to make your yard a great place for our pollinators and animal life, and for your children and families to enjoy. Each one of you has the capacity to make this town a much healthier place for future generations. And you can do it through working on something that you love, gardening. I really believe that it's time we start to shift our perspectives about the practices that we're using in our yards. And so I'd like to challenge each person here listening tonight to think about what they can do in that regard. I think that each one of us can be the change that we want to see, and we can show our kids how to embrace a more natural backyard.
All right, that was amazing.
Actually, I'm not quite done, Meredith.
Oh, okay.
So I want to say thank you to all the folks who shared the photos of their own native gardens, and to those of you who will leave here tonight, hopefully with a commitment to begin to grow native. If you would like to know more information, our committee has a presence on the town website. This QR code will take you directly there. If you forget to make a copy of this, you can just go to the town website and type in the name of our committee, and it will pop up. Or you can also just type in Native Plant Guide, because I'd like to give you a little quick introduction to this document that we've made, that we've created for mostly new gardeners. This is where you'll find it, right here on the website. The questions that are answered in this guide are the questions that I had as I began to learn more about native plant gardening over the last 6 or 7 years. So we put this guide together, and essentially it tells you why you should grow native plants and how you can do it. It tells you where you can buy them, lists many good sources, some resources to design a native plant garden, and as well as some recommended reading. And many of the books that are recommended in here are available at the Pepper Library. The meat of the document, however, are tables that are divided by, I'm sorry about the scrolling, by the different types of plants. So we have a section for trees, for shrubs, for ground covers, perennials, ferns, and grasses. And there's a table in here that tells you a list of great native plants that fit either your light and moisture needs. You can find out what color they are, the flowers are, when they flower, how big they get, and maybe a few tidbits about them, about the particular plants. And then the tables are followed by photos of each plant, so you can see what it would look like when it's mature or when it's in bloom. So that's all. I'm done now, Meredith. And thank you all for attending and listening to me for nearly a full hour. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to do this. So.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah. This guide is going to be invaluable to so many, especially I've seen a lot of the questions that have come in, and I know that that's going to be really helpful.
Great.
There are questions. There are quite a few. So how would you prefer to do this? Do you want me to just kind of start at the top and run through them and do them in order and see how many you're able to get to? I don't want to keep
Sure.
everyone forever, but I think some of these questions are great, and probably more than a few people would really like to know the answers. So, so the first question that I saw was from Anna. Are there any all-natural sprays that you would recommend for mosquitoes, or what do you recommend? Or yeah, what do you think?
Okay, so let me say first that I'm not a horticulturist, I'm not a botanist, I'm not a scientist. My heart lays in all of those areas. So what I'm telling you is what I've learned, but I'm not an expert in this area. What I do for mosquitoes is I try to use a repellent. I spray it on my clothing, try not to put it on my body. And I try to stay out of the yard during the times when the mosquitoes are most active. And I know that that's probably not the answer that folks want to hear. It's important to be able to let your kids play outside. And I understand the dilemma there of trying to find that balance between, what's safe for your kids and what's safe for the environment. I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for that.
That's okay. Yeah. And and it wasn't just mosquitoes. I mean, people are definitely curious about other pests, not only things like wasps and things like that, but I also saw one of the questions down at the bottom, not so much a pest, but just, what was it?
Ticks.
Sue was asking about woodchucks. The woodchuck ate my meadow rue, one of my favorites for all the bees and pollinators it attracts. Do I just need to accept that the woodchuck is going to eat it? Or is there something I can do to share the meadow rue with the woodchuck 50-50 split?
So let me tell you that I have a long-running love-hate affair with woodchucks. That I too wrestled with woodchucks eating first my vegetable garden many years in a row. It's heartbreaking to plant the beans and see them come up and wake up the next morning and they're all gone. So I get it. We had a woodchuck family that actually built their home right next to our vegetable garden. So after a few years, I decided they had just as much right as I did to be there, and that I had to change again. I had to change my way of thinking. So what could I do to prevent that? I put up a fence around the vegetable garden area. I provided other plants in the yard that the woodchucks could enjoy. In my current yard, we also have a family of woodchucks that come to visit us, and they multiply each year. One year we actually had 5 of them. We had 2 different families. One thing that I found that woodchucks love is eating clover. And so I've interspersed some white clover, which is not native in my yard, but it is good for pollinators and it keeps the woodchucks out of my garden beds mostly. But as I said, I think we all need to think about changing our perspectives on how we're looking at some of these pests that are coming into the garden. While we might not like it, I don't like that the deer come in the wintertime and eat the tips of all my newly planted shrubs off. I've also come to accept that it's part of nature. And I have a habitat garden and I need to put up with that because they have a right to be there. And I've offered the food for the pollinators, and why not the other animals? My personal perspective.
Sure. Sure.
What
And
about
well,
ticks?
so, sorry, was somebody trying to say something?
Yeah, what about ticks, keeping the tick control down?
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say next is while we're on that, can we pivot over to ticks and see if you have anything different to say?
I don't. Ticks are a problem. Again, I personally use bug spray, bug repellent on my clothing. I tuck the cuffs of my pants into my socks. It looks geeky, I know it does, but it does help. I wear a hat when I'm outside, so the ticks falling off the trees are gonna hit my hat. And when I come inside, I check myself thoroughly. And I've had Lyme. Uh, I get ticks all the time because I'm out in the yard. So sorry, I don't have a good answer for that either. Hopefully, we're going to get to a point where we do have some sort of medicine that's helpful in that regard for treating that.
Okay. A few people asked about, in terms of replacing traditional grass lawns, any suggestions on how to go about doing that, cost effectively, and
Mhm.
then what native plants or seeds would you recommend putting in to optimize the habitat once the grass and the lawn has been sort of transformed?
Well, this is a fairly new concept of making these mixed lawns with native wildflowers. And you'll see in that native plant guide, I give some suggested plants to put in there. What I tried last year, and I'll see how successful it is come this spring, was I ordered plugs, which are, small plants that come in trays of about 50 or 72 plants. And I ordered a plant called Self Heal or All Heal. It's got a little purple flower on it. It is a native plant. You might see it growing in the woods. It makes a great ground cover. It's sturdy. You can walk on it. You can mow it. Again, I have some clover interspersed in my yard for the pollinators. There's also a lovely little plant called bluets, which many people are probably familiar with. Trying to think of what else. The common rock phlox that you see in a lot of rock gardens around town that have these massive pink and purple flowers, you can intersperse those in your lawn. As far as how to do it, I mean, if the lawn's already established, then I would recommend putting plugs in and kind of letting them go. If you're going to tear out your lawn, that's a big job. The eco grass seed is more expensive than what you would typically buy in a Home Depot or Lowe's, but it is available. And in the native plant guide, I give some sources where you can send for seeds.
Okay, somebody did ask if there was a local greenhouse that you recommend that specializes in native plants for sale. That was Louise who asked that.
Okay, so yes, and in the native plant guide, again, I do give some local sources and some that are further away that have a larger inventory. So locally, we have a place in Littleton, which is in a private home called Rob's Gardens, and he opens up sometimes on the weekends and has a great variety of native plants. And he's right near the Littleton line in Groton. There's also Mason Hollow Nursery in Mason, New Hampshire, just beyond Parker's Maple Barn, that has a variety of quite a few natives. And then there's also, it's in Lunenburg, I think it's called Mass Central Gardens on Route 13, headed towards Leominster, that has fairly good supply of native plants there. Locally, that's about it. I think you'll find some of the nurseries might have a few native plants, but as far as an extensive selection, going to someplace like Garden in the Woods, which is in Framingham, making a day trip of it, you can get some great natives there at decent prices and feel confident that you're getting healthy plants.
Hey, Deb, this is Sarah Johnson. I would love it if when we go to the the annual plant sale here in Pepperell, if you could have a sticker or something that you put on the plants, on the cards that have the plants that are native species, something that's quick and easy for us to identify, oh, that's one we want to put in our yards.
Um, Thanks, Sarah. Great idea. We do have our native plants at the plant sale in town in a separate section, actually, and it's labeled a native plant section. I don't have stickers on every single plant that tells you that it's natives, but we do have educational information, and I think we're separate enough from most of the plants that, you know, if you want native plants, those are the tables that you would go to.
I don't recall seeing that in the past, but you've changed my thinking so much tonight that I'm absolutely certain I'll notice that this year. Thank you so much.
I'm not sure what the status is, if the garden club is actually having a sale this year. I guess we'll find out soon. Typically it's in May.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I should probably know, but I think it might, that's a question for Deb. I'm not sure if she's still on. So, but anyway, yeah, thanks for that list in Mason, Littleton, Lunenburg. I don't know, I didn't tell anybody this, and I started recording kind of late, but this is recorded. So it was like just on the first slide when we started recording. So it's going to be available on the Lawrence Library's YouTube channel at some point. And I see, okay, someone is trying to speak.
Linda said in the chat that the plant sale is May 21st.
Oh, great. Okay.
Thank
I
you.
should know that, but
Thank you.
is it actually at the library or is it the Fitz this year? I feel like it's I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm terrible.
The
Okay.
library, Senior Center.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. So let's see. Did I think there's a few more questions. Anything in the guide on like budget friendly ways to get started on all of this? If somebody's really just kind of starting from scratch, either if they're replacing their lawn or if they just want to like really, you know, beef up their garden and put a lot of your suggestions into play.
Make friends with native plant gardeners.
Yeah, that's a great one.
Very generous group. Native plants spread, and we need to take care of our gardens too and thin them out sometimes. And I'm always happy to share plants if I've got some to share. And I know most of the gardeners that I know, gardeners in general, are generous folks. So that's a great way to get free plants.
Awesome. All right. Excellent. Does anyone else have any more questions? Or I hope I got them all. I don't see any more popping up. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. And I would say probably by Monday or so, we should have this whole recording available in on our YouTube channel, the Lawrence Library's YouTube channel. So you can go back and catch any parts where you want to hear it again. I know
This is wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, it was so much covered. It was amazing.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity to be able to do it. Appreciate it. So,
Absolutely. And I don't know if you saw all the comments, Deb, but there were a lot of people who gave you accolades. And so I'll make sure to send those to you.
thanks again. Take care,
All right.
everyone.
All right, everyone have a great night. Thank you.